and welcome to our budget briefing for 2025. My name is Emmett Oliver. You're very welcome along, and we'll be looking today at the most salient and pressing issues in Budget 2025. And I'm glad I'm joined today by Brian Kelly, who's a tax partner at EY, and also have Jennifer Sweeney, who's a tax director at EY. Folks, you're both very welcome, first of all.
Great.
Thank you for joining us.
Very much, Emmett, for having us.
I might just say, first of all, sketch the scene, I suppose, a little bit. The Minister, Jack Chambers, he's his inaugural budget. He obviously has a lot more resources available than to, I probably safely say, any other previous minister, just in terms of the raw numbers available. But of course, it's all about choices and measures and policy decisions. If I can come to you first, Jennifer, can you just sketch out what you think the priorities might be in this budget and the kind of areas the minister is going to tackle from your perspective?
Yep. So as you said, look, the minister does have a lot to play around with, and we are in a fortunate position that we are in surpluses and have been in surplus budget situations for the past number of years. When you compare that to what we're seeing in the UK and the US, I suppose from a personal tax perspective, which is my area of expertise, and my colleague Brian can certainly look and comment on the sort of the more macro level. From, I suppose, a personal tax perspective, what we're looking to see is the easing of pressures, financial pressures that the public have been facing in recent years with high inflation, and obviously looking to see some measures around cost of living, trying to address and ease those pressures. What we're also wanting to see, I suppose, is easing in certain taxes, potentially to assist in getting more money directly into people's pockets and purses.
And I suppose it's a difficult balancing act for the minister in the sense that he wants to support people with, as you say, the cost of living crisis. I know inflation has come down from its highs, but equally, I suppose the other part of what he has to do is to make sure that the measures he's introducing don't either stoke up inflation as well. So it is a fine line for him, isn't it?
Exactly. So that's it. So what we're seeing that's being released in the media is that there is particular measures that are being introduced. It's potentially either by tinkering with the tax rates and the tax bands and the USC rates and tax credits to assist directly getting more money into people's pockets. But potentially as well, what we're seeing is through a range of measures, and probably what we'd like to see is more targeted measures as opposed to just wider measures that are available to everyone, where there's going to potentially be an influx of cash in the economy that could overheat and sort of start rising that inflation rate again.
Brian, I suppose from the minister's perspective, there's a lot of different choices here. He can obviously increase state payments. That's one way. He can try and do things that maybe would help with certain overheads that people have in their daily lives, whether it's transport or childcare. There's a whole range. And in some ways, that's his difficult challenge. There's so many options there. As Jennifer says, a big surplus to be paid out. So that's the challenge, is just being very targeted, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's, as always, this phrase comes up every year. It's about striking the right balance. Emmett, I'm sure you've heard that before. What we know from the minister's summer economic statement in July is that the government's priorities here are to support households and firms where they can, deliver improvements in public services, and boost the resilience of the economy. And that includes enhancing infrastructure projects or capital constraints, including housing. So I think we're going to see a focus, and I think the way I see this budget is it will be a bit of a giveaway budget. It's obviously a pre-election budget. They need to make sure they don't stoke demand too much and overheat the economy, as you've said. The 4Ds concept that we've heard about, the agenda that the government sees in the future in terms of the demographic change that's coming and is already underway. Decarbonisation, we know what we need to do there, but we're behind our targets and we need to address that. Digitalisation then is digitalising the economy, modernising the economy. And then that's in the context of what's happening globally. There's a sort of a drive towards deglobalisation. So all of that is how the government is seeking to chart a course, for the next cycle, the next fiscal cycle. As you said, the budget surpluses we're running consecutively are, pretty unheard of in most of our lifetimes. It's a great position to be in, but there's a huge responsibility in terms of infrastructure and value for money from infrastructural investments. And I think making sure that the minister alleviates the cost of living pressures whilst not overheating the economy, and then setting a course for future infrastructural investment is really where I think our ministers are focused. I think the thing to recall that there's two, I suppose, data points that are important to recall. 2 years ago, and both Pascal Donoghue and Jack Chambers have talked about this. 2 years ago, we had inflation at 10%. It's now expected to be down to close to 2% even by the end of the year. So I think the let's say the interest rates that have been affecting people through their mortgages and other sort of general inflation rates are easing already. So in that context, the government needs to be careful about actually how much they seek to fuel the economy, how much they actually seek to spend in the economy, and not further sort of get that inflation rate going back in the wrong direction. So I think that's it. It's the other point I wanted to make, Emmett, is again from a fiscal and from a public finances perspective, I think where we sit today, I think in 2012, our national debt to national income ratio was 160%. I think our expectation is that by the end of 24, it'll be down to 72%. So the health of our budget surpluses and our sort of other windfall gains that we're experiencing, and the sort of the ability the flexibility that gives the government is, as you said, is pretty unique, and it's not something we've experienced in too many budget cycles in
No,
the past.
you'd feel sorry for some of the previous ministers who would have loved to have had these set of figures in front of them. Jennifer, just to talk through taxation in particular and other measures, but just talking about the average household and how they might be situated in all of this. Taxation, I suppose, is maybe less visible. You only see it briefly in your pay packet, and you may only not even calculate it. Some people obviously very, very much do. But do you think taxation is something where there will be more money going back into people's pockets, or would you look at some of the other measures, the direct supports? Just talk us through some of that.
Yeah, if I start off with taxation, what we know from the budget is 1.4 billion has been put aside for tax measures, and with tax measures, they can be utilised in a certain manner that impacts the taxpayer directly. So essentially, reducing the amount of tax that they're paying on their salary, and impacting that net pay that is hitting their bank account or their pockets to try and increase it. And the minister, Jack Chambers, has actually said that he wants to try and put a budget in place that workers are gaining up to €1,000 from the various measures that are going to be introduced by this budget. I think last year it was roughly around €800, whereas he's striving now to just increase that to €1,000. And he has also said that he wants to particularly target low to middle income workers, that they are an absolute priority from the range of measures that he is looking at introducing. So I suppose if we just kind of take a step back, if we look at the tax, and I suppose what we've seen in prior years with budgets, they do a little bit of tinkering with the standard rate band and USC bands and your tax credits. So if we take a look at that and see probably how are they going to spend that 1.1 billion, just trying to anticipate it, I can walk you through some figures.
Please, yeah.
So if
I hope you'll have good news for me personally, is what I'm hoping to hear.
bear with me, I'll try and walk you through the figures, and we'll try and use it as a guide to where we think that this 1.4 billion is potentially going to be spent on those tax measures. So what we've seen released in recent weeks is the standard rate band is likely to be increased by €2,000. So the standard rate band for a single person.
So you can earn more before you get taxed.
Exactly. So what the standard rate band is essentially the amount of income an individual can earn that will be subject to our standard rate of tax, which is currently 20%. That standard rate band is 42,000 per year for a single person. So they're looking to increase that. I think, or it's anticipated that they're looking to increase that by €2,000.
Do you think the 2,000 is a lot in comparison to other budgets? I don't know the figures, but it sounds chunky enough to me. But
yeah, like it depends on, I suppose, if you look at various budgets, depending, like, if you go back 10 years, during the austerity years, there probably wasn't any increase. And in sort of prior to that and in other years, you would have seen an increase, and it could be in increments of 1,000 or 1,500 or 2,000. So we reckon the 2,000 is kind of in line with what we've seen in prior years. Another measure that we are hearing a lot of information about is that they're looking to reduce the USC rate of 4%, which most people would be paying, to 3.5%.
They've been chipping away at that for a few years,
Yeah.
because it's not a very popular tax. Not that any tax is, but it's one that is sort of visible, and people are, because it was brought in a few during the financial crisis, it has annoyed people. So that's interesting. They might have another little.
And that's correct. Yeah, it's so they've always played around with the bands of income that's subject to the various rates of USC. It ranges from 0.5% all the way up to 8%, depending on the level of earnings. And what they're trying to do is, I suppose, those middle rates, where you have income roughly around the early 20,000s to the early 40,000s. They're looking at trying to reduce that, because then it's more targeted. A wider range of taxpayers can actually avail of that. What we've seen is, by just those two measures, so increasing the standard rate band by €2,000 and potentially reducing the USC rate from 4% to 3.5%, that's roughly going to cost about 730 million. So if we again take a step back, there is 1.4 billion that's been put aside for tax measures. We've already, by just introducing those two measures to alleviate the costs that taxpayers are facing, and to put a little bit more money back into their net pay, that's costing about 730 million, which leaves a balance of roughly around 630 million for them to play around with. We anticipate potentially what they've done, what they've done in prior years, is that they will probably adjust the personal tax credits as well. What we saw last year was they increased, I think, the majority of the tax credits by €100. The year before that, they increased it by €75. So there's an anticipation that potentially what they're going to do is they will increase probably the core personal tax credits. So that's your single person's tax credit, your married person's tax credit, widowers and single parents tax credits, by €100. And then there is the other more frequently used tax credits, such as the PAYE tax credit and the earned income tax credit, by potentially €50.
So when you put all of that together, there's going to be a tax package that will have a big uplift for the average person, household, and so on.
That's it. It's a direct impact, because it's going to influence the amount of net pay that they can
Okay.
take home. The overall cost, I suppose, of just doing those, increasing those tax credits, is roughly around about 568 million for a full year. So if you couple that with the 730 million for the increase in the USC, the standard rate band, and decreasing the USC bands, that is eaten into a huge portion of your 1.4 billion that they've allocated to tax measures.
Okay.
And we do know that they also want to recognise renters and the increasing pressures that renters are facing.
So the renter's credit.
Yeah, so
would
there
be
is a
increased.
rent tax credit, which is currently €750, and we're seeing a lot of indications that that's likely to increase to €1,000. So again, we've got to factor that into the costings I previously.
Let me bring Brian in on this as well. Brian, obviously the housing crisis is something, it's been with us for a few years now. So this budget isn't going to, on its own, eliminate. Obviously, interest rates are controlled elsewhere by the ECB, so there's nothing the Irish government can do there. We've heard about this renters' credit, which will increase. Do you think that and other measures may be able to help on the housing piece, or is that more infrastructural in nature?
I think it really is infrastructural, and again, it's down to our these capacity constraints that we have. I mean, I think we have to recognise that the government is focused on this and is putting record investment into housing and social housing, but we know that more investment is needed to support home building. Look, the inherent cost of land in the state is an issue, and I think the residential zoned land tax, I think, is something that a lot of people are calling for, to actually put some teeth to that and actually start levying it. And ultimately, what that would do is hopefully sort of release more land that housing could be built on into the sort of into the market, and therefore make it more affordable for
Make hoarding less attractive, I suppose, and
exactly
flush out more land. Yeah.
flush out more land, exactly, and ultimately make it more cost effective for someone to actually either build a housing estate or build social housing.
So do you think that will be in this set of measures? It seems to be moving backward and forward. And then there was mention of, well, what about people who are farming land and so on?
Yeah, I mean, that one is probably harder to predict in terms of what decisions are going to make on that. I think the other impeding factor in recent years has been the high cost of capital, the high interest rates. So I think the fact that interest rates are hopefully on the way down, in response to inflation being under control, will mean that actually getting finance to sort of build some of these things will alleviate things. I think the other real capacity constraint that we all know about is the limited supply of construction workers that we have. So, I mean, we've sort of debated amongst ourselves in terms of what could they do there. There is clearly there's a focus for people educated here to go to third level university courses. I think incentivizing it and making it easier for trades people to be in the market and to sort of fill that void on the sort of supply side is key, and that goes to both new build, in terms of infrastructure. It goes to all types of infrastructure that the country needs to stay competitive in terms of water investment, housing is part of it, road, rail, electricity generation.
Are you saying something needs to be done to get more construction workers into the system? Maybe it's not in this budget, but that's
Yeah, I think
It's a long-term gain, because we were debating this morning, and we were saying there is a huge focus for everyone to pursue third level education, but essentially, we have a lot of
so into the apprenticeship route
yeah,
is there too.
there are alternatives there, and I think we need to look at investing and encouraging these alternative routes, such as apprenticeships and the various trades. Certainly, we do have a lot of tradesmen who have exited Ireland for various reasons. They've either gone to the UK, Australia, maybe travelling. So we also need to look at how we're going to encourage them to come back. And there's a range of tax incentives there that we can utilise, that we do use in our professional industries, that potentially could be extended and looked at to attract,
And do they target particular sectors? Is that what you mean? Like they be aimed at particular worker groups or occupations, or is it just the ones you're talking about earlier, the general, the USC and so on, and the allowances, the bans changing? Do you think they could help, or do you think something that's more specific might be needed?
I think, yeah, I think by certainly looking at the amount of taxes that people are paying is one way of addressing it. I do think as well, potentially having targeted tax incentives to attract, where we're experiencing staff shortages, such as with tradespeople. Health as well is another area. It certainly would be beneficial. So it could be a two-prong approach, that you're looking at your general taxation, but then you also have very targeted incentives to
Yeah, and
attract, Irish people who have left and to get them to come back, but also
we are living in a global mobile labour market, whether we like it or don't like it.
Yeah, and look, I think the other point there is that when we talk to business people all the time, and when we talk to either Irish domestic businesses or multinational businesses that have invested here, what they tell us is like this is the biggest issue for them. It's actually finding the talent, and then it's housing the talent.
Yeah.
So we have incentives like SARP, which is an incentive that encourages sort of higher
Executives come in for a
Executives
period
come
and so on.
in,
Yeah.
yeah.
sort
You're
of
saying,
feeding teams,
yeah.
and but
But I think
ultimately
schemes like
it's
that would be attractive, and certainly making them more accessible
Well, it's
to
interesting,
wider range
yeah.
of people.
We'll see if the minister is listening to this podcast as he puts his finishing touches.
Dive into Budget 2025 alongside EY's tax experts and discover what the new measures mean for your business. Find all the real-time insights and analysis on how this budget impacts Ireland, organisations and individuals. Visit eybudget.ie.
Let me just broaden it out a little bit more, because we're a bit stuck on time, as obviously tend to be in these productions. The one that I suppose strikes me is the hospitality sector is looking for the VAT rate to go back. That's one that's going to be interesting. So that whole area of VAT and tax on business, generally, we've already mentioned we know the minister's unlikely to touch the corporation tax rate, which is obviously at an international level being reformed and so on. But do you think the tax on business, whether it's hospitality or other businesses, is something that will be a centerpiece for him?
Well, I think our expectation is that the sort of the business tax measures will be fairly limited in a couple of areas. We are absolutely expecting something that's been sort of planned by the Department of Finance all year, and you're probably familiar with it, Emmett. It's a participation exemption for foreign dividends. So multinationals that have an Irish holding company structure today, or an Irish business that has investments overseas in the form of other legal subsidiaries and entities. Today, foreign source income under Irish rules is subject to tax at by default at our higher 25% rate of tax. And Ireland is sort of out of whack, let's say, with competitor countries like the Netherlands, like Luxembourg, like the UK, for example, whereby they have exemption systems. They have a territorial regime, and they exempt foreign source income from further taxation. Effectively, the thinking there is that the income has been subject to tax in the source country already, so there's no value to having another layer of tax applied at the shareholder level. So I think that is due to come in. It's well signalled at this point. It's a rule that will simplify to some extent Irish sort of holding company compliance, for example, and it'll apply to dividends received by an Irish company after the 1st of January 2025. And the nexus is where the dividend is received from an EU or tax treaty member country.
So you think that will bolster our FDI offering?
Well, I think
is that the effect of it will.
I think it'll help. I think it's something that, given the step change, the global minimum tax that was introduced in the Finance Bill and Finance Act last year, which introduced the 15% minimum tax rate. I think that has obviously, to some extent, cut against Ireland's 12.5% sort of rate from a competitiveness perspective. And I think what this would do is sort of, at a minimum, simplify compliance and potentially incentivize.
So it's a low hanging fruit in a good sense, that it can be done quickly and
exactly.
have a fairly quick impact. It
can be done quickly. It's taken a lot of work. I wouldn't underestimate the amount of work the Department of Finance has done this year to get it delivered. So I think the Trojan amount of work there by our draftspeople. But I think it will, it'll definitely be a welcome sort of tool in our sort of competitiveness toolbox from a tax perspective. I think the other area that people are calling for, Emmett, is on the R&D tax credit side. So again, as part of our adoption of the global minimum tax rules, last year we very in a very welcomed measure, we increased our R&D tax credit from 25 to 30%. We also made it refundable, which was key from a pillar two, from a top up tax perspective. So I think, again, there's further calls for what other credits could we introduce? Could we introduce new credits on?
That's really interesting, because you kind of thought, because of the 15% minimum tax, that whole area was kind of a bit frozen. But you're saying there is live policy decisions there that the minister could take to make some changes.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's a gaming tax credit that was introduced a couple of years ago that is one sort of area that to incentivize sort of production of games. In Ireland, and there's other green energy incentives that I think people are probably expecting a ramp up of that as part of encouraging investment in green energy. So again, you could see super credits of maybe 40-50% if that's something that the government is seeking to use as a lever to sort of incentivize people to invest.
Jennifer, Brian has given us pretty good indications, but might be there.
Yeah.
We'll see next week. But he sounds like he knows what he's talking about and has a good insight into it. In terms of surprises, there's always one or two that people don't see coming. Sometimes they can be a bit of a political hand grenade, things that look innocent on paper, but people strongly object to, and so on. Equally, there can be a nice surprise on the other side, something that people don't get. Is there anything that you'll be sort of looking for for yourself as you hear him reading his speech out, and it'll be online, obviously, the actual speech text as well. Is there anything in that you'll be kind of going, oh, that's something I didn't see coming, or something you might, maybe the rest of us haven't seen coming that you're spotted?
Um, I suppose in terms of surprises, we've seen this with various years of budgets that there is quite a bit of leakage, and I suppose the government is
I blame the
testing
media.
in the media, trying to, I suppose, test the waters in terms of certain incentives or measures that they're looking to introduce. So you actually do find that when you come to budget day, a lot of what has been released in the public domain in the weeks coming up to it actually transpires to be in the budget or something similar to it. That's not to say that there's always one or two surprises in there. And I suppose we'll just have to wait until we actually see that, which is the 1st of October. I suppose there's probably two items that I would remind people of that were introduced last year and in prior budgets that may catch certain business owners and people by surprise. So the first is that the PRSI rates will increase on the 1st of October of this year. So on budget day, next
Okay.
Tuesday.
We think we're talking tax cuts, but
Yeah, and I suppose
Again,
the
it
hope
goes
is
against the
those.
competitiveness point that we talked about in terms of, that whole competitiveness from a labour market perspective and the cost of employment. I think there's a measure
Yeah.
in prior years.
And there's this idea of a fiscal drag where the government, I shouldn't say free money because it's not free money, but what I mean by that is because of inflation, certain categories and thresholds get passed because there's more, the salaries go up or the money goes up. And that brings, just by standing still, the government get extra revenue. So that people kind of miss that,
Yeah, and I think that's it. We just need to be mindful that, yes, they are trying to give back roughly around €1,000 to taxpayers, as Jack Chambers has said. Ideally, what you're hoping to see is in those measures where they're going to do that, that it also takes into account any prior measures that the government has put in place that potentially kind of takes away from that 1,000. So the first is, PRSI rates will be rising on the 1st of October, which is essentially next Tuesday. So Class A PRSI contributor, which is the majority of people who are working in the private sector, pay employee PRSI at 4%. That's going to increase to 4.1%. So there is going to be a direct impact there on your net take-home pay, which you hope will be balanced out
by the other measures you
various
talked earlier, right?
incentives.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Employers' PRSI will also rise from by the same percentage. So again, it's an additional cost to employers, on top of employing individuals. And this is the first of 6 incremental increases between now and 2028 that was introduced in last year's budget because the government is looking to preserve the social welfare fund, and this is viewed as a way of actually.
You don't hear these things discussed. It's really interesting. I mean, it's sort of hidden away in the text, those kind of measures. So you're saying overall they'll offset in other areas, but they're still there. Yeah.
That's the hope that they would do that.
And you had one more.
The one more as well. Again, it was introduced previously. Is auto enrolment that is
Pensions.
due to commence on the 1st of January 2025, and the legislation was passed earlier this summer to facilitate that actually occurring. Now, there's still a lot of pieces that need to be ironed out, but this again is an additional cost that employers will need to face. Essentially, what auto enrolment is essentially it's an incentive that's been introduced by the government to encourage people to start saving for their retirement much earlier and to actually make to actually contribute, because I think up to a third of workers do not have a private pension or an occupational pension scheme in place. So it is a scheme that is essentially that once you are an individual who is working, that's aged 23 to 60 years, and you earn €20,000, that you're likely then going to be a candidate that's going to be automatically enrolled into this savings scheme that is government led. So there is a couple of questions there that needs to be answered in terms of how is that going to be run in parallel by employers who have occupational pension schemes, that they may have some employees that participate to that occupational pension scheme and other employees who don't by choice, but then are now essentially going to be subject
a
to
lot
this
of busy
auto-enrolment.
pension departments in companies
Payroll and
and
pension
payroll and HR and all of that. Brian, we're going to have to wrap up soon, but maybe you could maybe take a broader look at the overall budget and the direction. I suppose and this is just a personal view, it's not an EY view, but I suppose the minister has to look at the short terms. We talked all these measures that Jennifer has talked us through for the year ahead. There's sort of short term pieces that would give some relief from inflation and interest rates that have been going up. But then there's the sort of the longer, the medium term view where, as you mentioned yourself, the bottlenecks, the infrastructural issues. And I suppose in some ways, a budget is a short term set of measures for the year ahead. So maybe we're being unfair on the minister to look at these bigger infrastructure. He's not going to be able to correct all of those in the budget. But are you looking for things that might be more macro in nature in this budget that will help some of the, you've already mentioned labour tightness already, but is there other things you're going to be looking out for that aren't those short-term measures, as important and all as they are, but are more sort of into the medium and long term that he might have in his speech?
Yeah, I mean, we know about obviously the sort of rainy day funds that have been established, and I think you would have some people suggesting, well, look, why not use those rainy day funds for investment in Irish infrastructure? Rainy day funds that are funds that will be built and potentially invested in derivatives markets overseas. Who knows what they're going to be invested in? But can we put those funds to use within the Irish economy and get value for that from capital investment? So I think the task here, I think, as we set out, is it's a pre-election budget, but I think the government has been fairly responsible in terms of where they're looking to sort of focus investment, and they are very clearly planning for Ireland's future in terms of where they see the bottlenecks that are coming down the line.
And we're aging, of course.
We talked about the 4Ds at the start. I mean, I think that it's very clear that there's messaging coming here that we are growing older, as you say. The world is changing. It's becoming more fragmented. There are more sort of events in the last sort of 10 years. COVID, obviously, the issues, the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, in terms of how that's escalating. So I think Ireland has been very resilient through all that change in recent years. I think what citizens of Ireland are looking for now is, well, how are we going to sort of adapt ourselves as a sort of modern sort of country, and how are we going to sort of plan for the future and ultimately do that in an equitable way so that there's prosperity, for all. And I think that's also part of what Mario Draghi's report sort of calls for at a European level. I think the some of what Mario Draghi is concerned about, which I think some Irish government ministers would share that concern, is how do we invest in a way that sort of lifts all boats and not in a way that is sort of selective in any sort of part of the economy or to certain investors. I think that's the way you keep the EU project on the track for the future. And really what Draghi is calling for at a European level is I think an additional 800 billion of investment at a European level year on year in capital projects, and that's across the members.
And you want to make the investment as productive as possible, so you get some of your money back.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's the big test as well. All right. Well, folks, thanks for participating. There's plenty of food for thought there. We'll have you in again next week on Thursday. We've been looking at budget 2025. We'll have a fresh look again on Thursday and look at the detailed measures and what was there, surprises or otherwise. You can get more information on budget 2025 if you visit eybudget.ie, where you can have a look, and there's various information and calculators there about the different measures. So we'll have our viewers have a look at that. But for the moment, both of you, thank you very much. That was Jennifer Sweeney, who's the tax director at EY, and Brian Kelly, who's a tax partner at EY. Thank you both very much.